What can help us survive and even more thrive during exile, during the diaspora, or even better yet, end the exile, remedy the exile, and conversely, what can actually fuel the exile and, God forbid, give it more strength and power over us? Okay, friends, the story begins. We are exploring a very relevant passage of Talmud because this is relevant to the time period we find ourselves on in the Jewish calendar. We're approaching the month of Av. We're approaching the 9th of Av, the day that the Beis HaMikdash, both temples, had been destroyed. And the Talmud explores the story, one of the stories, that actually led to the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, of the temple. The way we see things, the way humans see things, right? If you were to ask the average historian, why was the temple destroyed, right? Well, because the Babylonians destroyed it, or the second temple, because the Romans destroyed it. And that's true, right? And you could analyze that. Did they not like the Jews? What was the reason for anti-Semitism? What was the cause? But when it comes to analyzing these things internally as Jewish people, we always attribute these things to our own behavior. There's a line that we recite in the Musaf prayer. Because of our sins, we've been exiled from our land. Well, why is it our fault? It was the Romans. Okay, but the question is, why did God allow this to happen in the first place? We assume that we could have been a little bit better and something we did was off. Now, that's a very important approach, by the way, approach when it comes to introspecting our own lives. When it comes to somebody else's suffering, we would never do that, right? You must be suffering because of this. We don't do that. We empathize and we say, God, you have no right to do that. That wasn't cool. But when it comes to our own suffering, especially collectively as a community, we often ask ourselves, well, what led to this? And the Talmud says that what led to the destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians was the immorality of the Jewish people, was their engagement in idolatry, was their engagement in relational immorality, right? The Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, was burning within them. The Talmud then says, it's a different section of Talmud than we're doing right now, but the Talmud then says, well, what about the second temple, where they were, for the most part, more moral and not engaged in idolatry, and we're doing mitzvahs and we're studying Torah? They were pretty much on the mark. So what led to the destruction of temple number 2 by the Romans? And the Talmud says it's because it was baseless hatred, sinat chinam, baseless hatred, unjustifiable hatred. Sometimes we dislike behavior that people have, and sometimes we dislike people and we blame it on their behavior. And the latter apparently is not conducive for Jewish community, nor a Jewish home for God. Okay, that's a Talmud in a different tractate. In our tractate, we actually go into the story of what historically took place that led to the destruction. Take a look at the second to last paragraph on the link that we had sent. It's Tractate Gittin, 55b. It's the bottom of the page. On the link that we have, it's the second to last paragraph. And we have a story. Do you guys see it where it says the Gemara explains? You guys have it? Second to last paragraph, Gittin 55b. It should be on that link. The Gemara explains that Jerusalem was destroyed on account of Kamtza and Bar Kamtza, 2 different people. It's unclear whether they were related with their similar last names. The word bar in Aramaic means son of. So some commentaries suggest that Bar Kamtza was the son of Kamtza, and some say they were just friends or acquaintances. This is as there was a certain man whose friend was named Kamtza, and whose enemy was named Bar Kamtza. He once made a large feast and said to his servant, go and bring my friend Kamtza. The servant went and mistakenly brought him his enemy, Bar Kamtza. Right? He got the invitations confused. He got the address wrong. The names were too similar. And Bar Kamtza ended up at this party. How do you think this host reacted? His enemy shows up. The man who was hosting the feast came and found Bar Kamtza sitting at the feast. The host said to Bar Kamtza, that man is the enemy of that man. That is, you are my enemy, essentially. He was saying, you're my enemy. What do you want here? Arise and leave. Bar Kamtza said to him, since I've already come, let me stay and I'll give you money for whatever I eat and drink. Just don't embarrass me by sending me out. Right? Misunderstanding, miscommunication. Bar Kamtza realized, right? He thought who knows what Bar Kamtza was thinking? Maybe he thought that he wanted to make peace, or who knows, right? He quickly realized what the situation was. Please don't throw me out of this party. Uh, I'll pay for my meal and just leave me alone, and we'll settle our fights afterwards. We'll take this outside, type of thing, right? Okay, I'm gonna go to the top of 56a. We continue. What does the host say to him? No, you must leave. Bar Kamtza said to him, I'll give you money for half the feast. Just don't send me away. The host said to him, no, you must leave. Bar Kamtza then said to him, I'll give you money for the entire feast. Just let me stay. Again, that's a lot of money because this was like the party of the century, apparently. A lot of dignitaries were there. A lot of rabbinic personalities were there. The host said to him, no, you must leave. Finally, the host took Bar Kamtza by his hand, stood him up, and took him out. Bar Kamtza was humiliated. After, second paragraph, at the top of the page, after having been cast out from the feast, Bar Kamtza said to himself, well, since the sages were sitting there and did not protest, the actions of the host, although they saw how he humiliated me, right, learned from it that they were content with what he did. They didn't protest. They must be okay with such behavior. I'll therefore go and inform against them to the king. This is referring to the Roman emperor, right? Because Jerusalem at this point, and Israel at large at this point, was controlled by the Romans to some degree. The relationship with the Jews and the Romans were on the rocks. He went and he said to the emperor, the Jews have rebelled against you. The emperor said to him, who says that this is the case? Bar Kamtza said to him, go and test them. Send them an offering to be brought in honor of the government and see whether they'll sacrifice it. So he's telling the emperor, send an offering, send an animal to the temple. You'll see if the Jews take your offering. If they don't, that means they don't like you. They're rebelling against you. Now, the truth is, in Jewish law, it's permissible to send, for non-Jews, to actually send donations to the temple and to send sacrifices. Isaiah and his prophecies refer to the temple as Beisi Beit Tfilah L'chol Ha'amim, right? God says, my house is a house of prayer for all nations. However, there was a bit of a shimsham over here that Bar Kamtza employed. The emperor went and sent with him a choice 3-year-old calf. Now, what's the significance of a calf out of all animals? We'll talk about that soon. Just circle that. While Bar Kamtza was coming with the calf to the temple, he made a blemish on the calf's upper lip, and some say he made a blemish on its eyelids, a place where, according to us, according to Jewish law, it's considered to be a blemish, an invalid sacrifice. But according to them, Gentiles rule for their offerings that it's not a blemish. Right? So therefore, when Bar Kamtza brought the animal to the temple, the priests would not sacrifice it on the altar since it was blemished, but they would also not explain this satisfactorily to the authorities who didn't consider it a blemish. Right? So Bar Kamtza did this little evil, simple but evil trick. He blemishes the animal, and now they're stuck. Right? It's actually a real ethical or halachic question. You have political pressure to violate halacha. Should you? Or should you stick to your values? It's a real question because on the one hand, there's what we call chilul Hashem, desecrating God, which is not a good thing. On the other hand, Judaism does prioritize the preservation of life. It's a real question here, right? So now the Talmud is going to get into the discussion that the sages had at this point. The blemish notwithstanding, the sages brought to sacrifice the animal as an offering due to the imperative to thought to sacrifice the animal as an offering due to the imperative to maintain peace with the government. So they said, let's just offer it because otherwise they're going to kill us, right? You're allowed to violate Torah law to preserve life. But then another rabbi pipes up and says, wait a minute, right? Rabbi Zachariah ben Avkolas. Remember Rabbi Zachariah, because we're going to talk about him soon. Said to them, if the priests do that, the people will say that the blemished animals may be sacrificed as offerings on the altar. We're setting a precedent for the future, an incorrect precedent for the future. That's not a good idea. Right? Maintaining peace is a good thing, but if you're going to set a precedent for the rest of history, that's a perversion of Jewish law. The sages said if we don't sacrifice it, then we must prevent Bar Kamtza from reporting this to the emperor. The sages thought to kill him so that he wouldn't go and speak against them. Again, Rabbi Zachariah said to them, well, if you kill him, people are going to say that one who makes a blemish on a sacrificial animal is to be killed. Again, you're setting a precedent for future generations that simply isn't true. You don't get the death penalty for bringing the wrong sacrifice or for blemishing the sacrifice. So now they're stuck. They're in this quandary. What do? The Talmud says as a result, they did nothing. Bar Kamtza's slander was accepted by the authorities, and consequently the war between the Jews and the Romans began. This is what led ultimately to the destruction of the temple on Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av. Right? Two Jews fighting, essentially, the host of the party, Bar Kamtza. That's why the Talmud said it's a baseless hatred that had destroyed the temple. But I want to read just the next paragraph because to me, out of this whole story, the next paragraph is something I find to be quite bizarre. Take a look at this next paragraph. Rabbi Yochanan says, the excessive humility of Rabbi Zachariah ben Avkolas. Right? He was the rabbi that said, well, wait a minute, the precedent issue. His excessive humility destroyed our temple, burned our sanctuary, exiled us from our land. And I guess our question over here, really two questions. Number one, humility. What humility? I would say his righteousness killed us. His, what other word would you use? His piousness, perhaps, excessive piousness, right? Perhaps he was overdoing it a little bit. There is a balance between, there's certain times where it's not good to be too religious. Right? And there is a concept of being excessively pious or excessively righteous, and that could be a problem at times. But the Talmud refers to it as humility. Okay, but there's a bigger question here. Out of all the people in this story, do you really think Rabbi Zachariah is the one to blame? There's a lot of other people we could blame in this story. We could blame the host of the party for throwing out Bar Kamtza and treating him so poorly. We could blame Bar Kamtza for taking revenge. That itself is a biblical prohibition. Rather than settling his issues in a more peaceful way. We could blame the rabbis who were at the party who were silent while Bar Kamtza was being humiliated and caved into the pressure of a wealthy benefactor. Out of all people, Rabbi Zachariah, who is just trying to preserve Jewish values honestly, why is he the guy being blamed? You see what's going on here? So I'd like to share with you two answers. And I believe that the answers to these questions are going to shed light on what can help us survive and even more thrive during exile, during the diaspora, or even better yet, end the exile, right? Remedy the exile. And conversely, what can actually fuel the exile and, God forbid, give it more strength and power over us. Let's start with Rashi's commentary. I want to go back to Rabbi Yochanan's statement for a moment. The excessive humility of Rabbi Zachariah ben Avkolas destroyed our temple. Right? He was the one who said, well, if you offer the sacrifice, it's going to set a negative precedent for the future, an incorrect precedent. If you kill Bar Kamtza, it's going to set a precedent for the future. Why are we using him to blame, right? So what does Rashi, what does the Talmud say? The excessive humility. Now, you know my hiccups with translations. There's always multiple ways of translating words, and when you use the English text, you're forced to pick one. When you stick with the original, you're welcome to use as many as you need, right? um, in Hebrew, it's anvat nutso. It's a long word there. Anava comes from the word anava, which actually does mean humility. It's commonly translated as humility. However, Rashi, in his commentary on the Talmud, says that it doesn't actually mean humility. Apparently, the word anava, which is often translated as humility, according to Rashi, and again, Rashi was an expert in Hebrew grammar, apparently anava literally means savlanut. You know what savlanut means? Patience or tolerance. You may remember a couple Torah portions ago. Um, the Torah referred to Moshe as the most humble of people to have graced the earth, to have faced the earth. Right? His siblings were speaking negatively about him, and Moshe was just silent. He was quiet. He accepted it. He didn't fight back. And the Torah says Moshe was the most humble of people to have ever graced the earth. And the word anava, the word humility, what does Rashi there on the Torah say? Same thing. Savlan, he was patient, he was tolerant. So let's look back at the Talmud. Rabbi Yochanan says the excessive tolerance of Rabbi Zechariah destroyed the temple. We often think that what creates peace is tolerance, and it's just not true. Tolerance destroys peace. Tolerance destroys communities. Because you know what tolerance means? I don't like you, but I'll tolerate you anyways. That's not good, right? There's this whole talk about different religions and we all have to tolerate each other. Tolerance. There's the Museum of Tolerance. Yeah, you're no good, but I gotta tolerate you. It's like offensive. It's not a good thing. Rabbi Zechariah was tolerating Bar Kamtza's behavior. If we kill him, it's going to set a negative precedence. So he prioritized a future precedence, which no longer exists because the temple had been destroyed, a potential negative precedence over somebody who wanted to kill Jewish people. Now, why is he to blame? If you ask me, and again, it's a good thing they didn't ask me, right? I'm just a commentator here. No, I'm kidding. But I would have thought that the rabbis at the party really have the biggest hand here because you're a respected rabbinical figure. And what you do gives a stamp of approval, or what you don't do gives a stamp of approval. But I might suggest that what Rav Zechariah did, which was tolerate Bar Kamtza's behavior, the sages at the party did the same exact thing. They tolerated the host's behavior. They were just as humble or tolerant. They did the same exact thing. They did the same exact thing. History, within the same, not that long after, who knows what the gap was in this story, right? It doesn't seem like it took over that long of a period of time, but things repeated itself. The sages were tolerant of the host's poor behavior, and now Rabbi Zechariah is tolerant of Bar Kamtza's poor behavior. And what destroys Jerusalem, what destroys the infrastructure of Judaism, the temple, unfortunately, is tolerating things that shouldn't be tolerated. This is the perspective of Rashi. Other commentaries disagree with Rashi and his grammatical assertion and believe that no, humility and tolerance don't overlap. They're actually two different things. And the word is actually humility. Let's take it literally. One of my favorite commentaries on the Agada portions of Talmud, on the portions of Talmud that are not strictly halacha, but more insights and stories, is the Ben Yehoiada by Rabbi Yosef Chaim of Baghdad from the late 1800s. He was the chief rabbi of Baghdad. He wrote a commentary unpacking these ideas in the Talmud, and he points out something fascinating. Why are we blaming Rabbi Zechariah again? Right, that's the big issue here. We're blaming him out of all people rather than Bar Kamtza, the host, or the other rabbis. And We're blaming his humility. So he says something fascinating. He says, just imagine the situation over here. They're at the altar. The animal comes. They're ready to sacrifice it. Rabbi Zochariah ben Avkulas, this rabbi, was a Cohen, which means he was actually on premises when this took place. He sees the animal. He's this incredible scholar. Right? There's a little bit of background that we don't know about him. Apparently, he was one of the top-ranking scholars that other rabbis didn't want to really disagree with. He was authoritative. And he's looking at the animal, and in his mind, he's thinking, I don't know, this is halachically acceptable. And what do the other rabbis say? I can't argue with him. On the other hand, was he speaking authoritatively? Not necessarily. He was just questioning. He was coming from a place of humility rather than assertion. He was not being decisive in Jewish law. What he should have done was decided we have to take the animal or we have to kill Bar Kamtza. He was questioning, is that really acceptable under the guise he was focusing on a very specific issue. And that was coming from a place of questioning, from a place of humility, rather than seeing himself as the authority to be able to make the decision that we're going to kill Bar Kamtza or that we're going to actually not accept that animal. His humility destroyed Jerusalem. As if, almost like the danger of being silent. You're similar to the rabbis, by the way, in the previous generation. So not the previous generation, in the previous part of the story, who were at the party and were silent in the face of Bar Kamtza. Right? At that party, these rabbis were silent. They were humble. What were they thinking? Possibly. I'd suppose they might have been thinking, it's not my party. It's not my place. I don't make the calls here. I'm just a guest. It's not my role to call out the host. I don't have that. I'm not in that position. Who am I? That level of humility is horrible because it destroys the infrastructure of Judaism. It creates exile. I'll tell you a great story. Hold on, I see a comment over here. What you permit, you promote. Exactly. There we go. Well said. I'll tell you a great story. Some of you are familiar with Rabbi Josh Gordon of blessed memory from Chabad.org, who a popular teacher many years ago, probably 40 years ago or so. There was a rabbi in Southern California who was young. He was in his 20s, and he was putting together a banquet celebrating his Chabad center and his community, Jewish community. It was a fundraising event. At this point, his Chabad center was probably just a couple of years old. And he's this young 25, 26-year-old rabbi. And he has this beautiful banquet and a band, and he has a comedian. And apparently, the comedian did not understand the crowd, did not understand that this is a Jewish community and this is a synagogue. And he kind of misread his audience and was using a lot of off-color language, off-color jokes. And it wasn't appropriate for a synagogue fundraiser. And this young 25, 26-year-old rabbi is just freaking out. The guy's just on stage and keeps going at it. And he's just like frozen, like, what do I do? Rabbi Josh Gordon is at this event. And again, he's a guest. It's not his synagogue. It's not his anything. He lives an hour and a half away. But Rabbi Josh Gordon is in the audience. He, again, is also pretty young himself, maybe late 20s at this point, early 20s, whatever. He walks up on the stage, grabs the microphone from the comedian, and he says, "Thank you very much. Let's give him a round of applause." And the comedian says, "I'm not done." He says, "Yes, you are. Round of applause, everybody." Rabbi Gordon could have easily said, "This is not my event. This is unfortunate. It's ugly. It's I feel bad for that rabbi who's in that position who's going to have to deal with damage control, but not my problem. And it's not my position, and I'm uncomfortable doing anything because who am I?" Rabbi Gordon said, "No. Now is not the time to be humble. There's a right and there's a wrong, and we have to stand up for that right and wrong." These rabbis did not stand up for what was right. Now, there's various explanations. Some say that It was possible that they weren't aware of the situation given on the, but there's a lot of explanation about the commentaries. But uh, the similarly with Reb Zachariah, we have to be assertive and stand up for what's right and not question our authority, because that feeds into galus, that feeds into exile, that feeling of false humility, that feeling of incompetence, that feeling of, what do we call it, imposter syndrome. There's a fascinating commentary literally on everything. Some commentaries comment on the Torah, some on the Talmud, some on. There's this one commentary called the Shalah, which is an acronym for Shin Lamed Hey, an acronym for Shnei Luchot Habrit, by Rabbi Yishayahu Horowitz from the 1500s. He was a Kabbalist and philosopher, and he has one of these commentaries that are literally on everything. He has myriads and myriads of writings, literally on everything, on the Torah, on the Talmud, on Halakha. It's like overwhelming amount of knowledge that he shares. And I recently read an insight from him. I thought this was fascinating. The Talmud says, a different section of the Talmud says, that any generation that did not see the construction of the temple, it's as if it had been destroyed in that generation. So on Tisha B'Av, hopefully not this Tisha B'Av, maybe we'll see the Beis HaMikdash, but last Tisha B'Av, right? We didn't see the rebuilding of the Beis HaMikdash. It's as if we saw it being destroyed. Why? What does that mean? So the way the Shalah, the Shnei Luchos Habris, Rabbi Yishayahu Horowitz of the 15th or 16th century explains it, any generation that still has those traits that led to the destruction of the temple, it's as if you're seeing it being destroyed now. You didn't rebuild it because we're still holding on to those traits, those negative traits, whether it be the hatred of Bar Kamtza and the host, or whether it be the imposter syndrome of Reb Zachariah ben Avkulas. We're holding on to these negative traits. That itself is destroying the Beis HaMikdash. That's causing galus, that's causing exile. And I want to end off with a teaching that I read from the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement. He says something fascinating. He says, too much humility, and it's just a loose translation, but he says, too much humility causes us to be distant from the service of God because we feel so lowly and we think so little of ourselves. We question our impact. Do my mitzvahs really make a difference? Does my davening really make a difference? Do I really have an impact on God? Do I really have an impact on the world? He says these types of thoughts damper our joy. They put stress on us, and they're antithetical toward the whole essence and spirit of Judaism, which is our mission to bring God down in this world. To do that, we have to be assertive. Right? Too much humility destroys the temple, destroys the sanctuary, and could, God forbid, exile us from our land. But conversely, confidence, confidence that's not coming from a place of arrogance, but that's coming from God put me in these shoes. I must have the ability to fill them. Gives us incredible powers to really change this world and make it a brighter, better place. Okay, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.